It was supposed to be a short hop across paradise. A quick flight over the turquoise waters framed by volcanic peaks and endless skies. Just another day on the Hawaiian Islands. But this flight would turn into the most surreal and shocking moments of these passengers' lives. April 28, 1988. The routine was shattered. Aloha Airlines Flight 243, a Boeing 737 carrying 89 passengers and 5 crew, would defy all odds in a horrifying airborne event that would shake the aviation world.
The top of the Boeing 737 peeled back like a canned good, turning the plane into a convertible.
And forever change how we think about aging aircraft. This particular flight, as the plane was at 24,000 feet, there was a loud rip and a scream of wind. The roof of the aircraft was torn away, exposing its passengers to open sky and throwing the flight crew into a desperate fight for survival. But what caused this aircraft to unravel mid-flight? Who were the heroes aboard that held it all together? And what did the investigators uncover that would force the industry to confront an invisible threat flying in plain sight? Welcome back, everyone, to AeroExploration and another installment of This Week in Aviation History. Today, we're going to be breaking down the harrowing tale of Aloha Flight 243. We'll break down the mechanics, the decisions that were made by the crew, and the failures that led to one of the most infamous accidents in American aviation history. So let's dive right into it. It's just before 5 a.m. in Hilo, Hawaii, when an Aloha Airlines first officer begins to pre-flight an aircraft, a Boeing 737-200, with tail number November 73711. Now, this specific aircraft has served Aloha faithfully for nearly 20 years. In the dim light of the ramp, with only the glow of service vehicles and overhead sodium lamps, the first officer checked over the aging jetliner. For this airline, the aircraft was a workhorse, flying multiple short legs a day around the Hawaiian Islands. Aloha Airlines was a staple of Hawaiian life, shuttling locals and tourists between the islands. On the day of the incident, this specific 737 had already completed 3 round-trip flights that morning without incident. With nearly 90,000 cycles of pressurization and depressurization, it had exceeded Boeing's design life for the airframe. And unlike long-haul jets that stay aloft for hours, island hoppers endure brutal wear, constant cycles of up and down, and the humid, salty air of the Pacific. At around 11 a.m., the original crew of the aircraft for the day signs off and a new crew steps in. Taking the helm of this crew is Captain Robert Schornsteimer, a former Navy pilot with more than 8,000 hours of experience. He serves alongside First Officer Mimi Tompkins, who herself is looking to upgrade to captain. A crucial part of when they take over this aircraft, there is no thorough pre-flight inspection done. At the time, it just wasn't required for the airlines. Not if one had been performed earlier in the day. So for this flight, the crew would take the aircraft on a routine leg from Hilo to Honolulu. Passengers would begin filing aboard Aloha Flight 243 for the short 35-minute journey. The weather on April 28th was calm. Nothing about the day indicated trouble ahead. Cabin crew had prepared for a quick service with 3 flight attendants: C.B. Lansing, Michelle Honda, and Jane Sato Tamida. After a normal takeoff, the flight began to climb steadily to its cruising altitude of 24,000 feet. The passengers relaxed, enjoyed the view, and the warmth of Aloha Airlines hospitality. As they continued their climb, flight attendants would begin drink service. Due to the fact that it was a shorter flight, the drink service started before they were a cruise. Then suddenly, a sound like a cannon, a violent explosion, a rip, and the scream of hurricane-force winds filled the aircraft. With a deafening explosion, an 18-foot section of the fuselage is ripped away, starting above the cabin near the seat 5A and tearing backwards. That portion of the roof was gone. The skin of the aircraft was peeled back like a tin can. At the time of this explosive decompression of the aircraft, Flight Attendant C.B. Lansing, a 37-year veteran of the airlines, was standing near where it ruptured and was instantly ejected from the aircraft. Up on the flight deck, First Officer Tompkins was immediately thrust backwards into her seat from the rapid decompression, disoriented by the force. The missing section of the roof of the aircraft went all the way to the rear of the flight deck. It was just gone. They had complete exposure to the cold and violent winds of 24,000 feet. But they had no time to panic. At this altitude, the amount of available oxygen in the atmosphere is lower than that of the surface. So if the pilots don't act quickly, they will be incapacitated by hypoxia. As they would struggle to maintain control of the aircraft, the flight crew quickly donned their oxygen masks. They would have multiple warning lights flashing, the controls were sluggish, but the aircraft was still responding. So amidst this chaos, the captain took the flight controls and fought to keep the plane under control. So Captain Shorensteimer would deploy the speed brakes and initiate a rapid emergency descent. Meanwhile, First Officer Tompkins would attempt to maintain communication with air traffic control on the ground. The flight deck would have been filled with noise so intense that speaking became impossible. The two would ultimately use hand signals to try to communicate to one another what they were trying to do as they worked through this emergency. Now, training at the time would have suggested to begin a descent, but not increase their airspeed. Now, obviously, they experienced some significant structural damage, and to increase the airspeed could possibly worsen that damage. They didn't know it at the time, but the only thing holding the flight deck to the rest of the fuselage were the floor beams. Basically, they were hanging by a thread. The crew ultimately decided to prioritize a quick descent so they could get to lower altitude, more oxygen, and get back to safety. There was also no working intercom or PA system to the back of the aircraft, so the pilots were not able to communicate with the rest of the flight crew behind them. Now, back in the cabin of the aircraft, the flight attendants were faced with an unimaginable situation. This is not anything that they had ever trained for. Now, the seats were bolted to the floor, everyone was still buckled in, but everything that was not strapped down was being sucked out of the aircraft or blown around in the cabin. Passengers would cling to their seats, and the wind would scream through the open fuselage.
What really got us was people strapped in the seats, not moving. They're just arms dangling in the air, hair flying in the wind.
Now, as for the other two flight attendants, Michelle Honda and Jane Sato Tomita were both injured as well. Despite not training for a scenario like this, the mission was still clear: the safety of the passengers. So even though they were injured, Michelle Honda would crawl on her hands and knees up and down the aisle of the aircraft, checking on her passengers. Now, Jane Sato Tomita had been slammed to the floor, and she had sustained a serious head injury. So with this huge gaping hole in the roof of the aircraft, it obviously had disrupted the basic aerodynamic structure and smoothness of the aircraft, causing vibrations through the fuselage, and there was other parts of the aircraft that would become at risk as well. So the plane rocked, and pieces of ceiling, insulation, and metal rained down on the passengers. There was also the issue of wiring that was in the ceiling that caused some electrical burns to some passengers. Overall, through this incident, 7 passengers were seriously injured, but remarkably, all the passengers seated in the aircraft survived. This includes the people that were sitting in the first 5 rows that were most exposed to open sky directly above them. So those in the cabin weren't even sure if the pilots were still with them, whether they were incapacitated, or who was flying the airplane. So Michelle Honda, as she checked on passengers crawling up and down the aisles, would ask people if they knew how to fly an airplane. Now, it wasn't just the passengers who were at risk here as well. With the fuselage torn open, the aircraft's structural integrity was significantly compromised. The left side of the fuselage had been shredded like a can of tuna. As the skin of the aircraft tore off, it started on the left side and ripped over to the right. The aircraft's engine fan blades were also damaged, as they would ingest pieces of flying debris from the aircraft. Back on the flight deck, the crew continues their emergency descent. Once at a lower altitude, they're able to finally slow down the aircraft, which was just enough relief to be able to make a mayday call to the Kalui airport.
Maui Tower, Aloha 243, we're in dock for landing. Descending out of 13, and we have rapid departure. We
So as they continued their emergency approach to the airport, they had to start slowing down the aircraft. So for those of you not familiar, as we approach an airport, we have to slow the aircraft down. One of the tools that pilots have at their disposal is flaps. The flaps will extend from the back of the wings, creating more lift and allowing us to fly at slower speeds as we approach the airport. So with the aircraft in such a delicate state, they were essentially test pilots, and they weren't sure how adding flaps into the equation might affect their aerodynamics. At first, the captain will call for flaps 5, which the aircraft seemed to tolerate. But as they increased the flaps even more to further slow, it would cause the aircraft to become more and more unstable. Ultimately, the captain decided flaps 5 would have to be sufficient for them to make an approach to the airport. Now, as if the crew didn't have enough on their hands, as they continued their descent to the airport, they found a new problem. Upon lowering their landing gear, they found that the main landing gear would deploy, but there was no indication in the cabin if the nose gear had actually come down. When pilots lower their landing gear and it locks into place, there's lights that will enunciate on their panel to indicate if the gear is down and in a safe position for them to land. They knew that the two main landing gear were down, they just weren't sure about that front nose gear. Normally in a situation like this, a pilot would do a pass of the airport and have air traffic control look and see if they could see if the landing gear was down. But obviously in this situation, every second mattered and they had to get the aircraft down, so a flyby wasn't an option. So the crew would have to activate emergency nose gear extension, which would allow them to unlock the gear itself and allow gravity to bring it down into position, hopefully locking it in place. But even after the emergency gear extension, there was still no indication as to whether the landing gear was actually down. Investigation would show that it was a faulty light that prevented them from knowing the position of their gear. The pilots continued to handle the approach with precision. Because they made the Mayday call, emergency personnel were already standing by. But at first, because of the noise in the aircraft, they weren't sure the full extent of the damage to the aircraft and the perilous condition that it was in. Miraculously, despite all odds, Captain Shorensteimer guided the damaged Boeing 737 into the airport on runway 2, landing safely after 13 terrifying minutes. Passengers would evacuate the aircraft once they were on the ground, amid wires, debris, and dealing with people with injuries. Yet against all odds, 94 people survived. The only fatality in this incident was flight attendant C.B. Lansing, who was immediately ejected from the aircraft upon that explosive decompression. Both her body and that section of the roof were never recovered. When the aircraft finally touched down, the damage was evident. The National Transportation Safety Board was activated and immediately began its investigation. What they found would send shockwaves through the aviation maintenance world. So the accident aircraft is a Boeing 737-200, and this model was known to have some vulnerabilities in its aluminum skin. So the skin of the aircraft itself was made up of sections of metal panels, 18 to 20-some feet long. They discovered that these metal pieces, designed to handle pressurization, had deteriorated over time. Boeing's original design was meant for 25 years of service or 75,000 cycles of the aircraft. Now, in Aloha 243's case, that was far exceeded. So now, investigators would focus on how explosive decompression occurred. Now, the Boeing 737 had what was called lap joints. Sections of the fuselage where metal layers would overlap. This would be joined by an adhesive and then a series of rows of rivets. However, the adhesive used in the earlier models of the 737-200 was susceptible to failure, putting more and more stress on the rivets that held these panels together. With these rivets handling more and more load, the aircraft's pressurized skin was more susceptible to cracking. As they further explored the adhesive that was used, they learned that it was prone to desponding, especially in humid environments, like the tropical conditions of Hawaii. More than 80% of the aircraft's flight cycles had occurred in the salty, humid environment of the Pacific. That made Aloha's aircraft especially vulnerable. They also learned that the fuselage had actually shown visible cracks during previous inspection, but they had gone unaddressed. So as we discussed earlier, Boeing knew that there were some issues with the aircraft as far as the delamination of the adhesive, and they had made recommendations to airlines on maintenance schedules to address this issue. However, the investigation would show that Aloha Airlines had not been following the protocols closely enough. Now, this could have been from a number of reasons, from the mechanics not properly understanding the airworthiness directives given by Boeing, or the fact that a lot of this maintenance occurred at night with not proper lighting conditions, and they may have missed some of the cracks. This plane had been flying short hops around the islands, and that caused continuous pressurization and depressurization of the aircraft, which over time became extremely stressful on the fuselage, ultimately contributing to its failure. Another unfortunate finding from the investigation was that one of the passengers had actually noted cracking along the fuselage while entering the aircraft. This passenger later reported saying that they were going to tell the flight crew, but they seemed so busy getting ready for the flight that they hadn't. So the findings of this investigation are sobering. The NTSB report would conclude that a combination of poor maintenance practices, excessive use, and a lack of appropriate inspections led to this tragic incident. Aloha Airlines aircraft had been pushed beyond its safe limits, and the structural fatigue ultimately led to this incident and the loss of a flight attendant and the near loss of everyone on board. Despite the damage that the aircraft sustained, the crew's bravery in navigating the aircraft back on the ground and ensuring the survival of almost everyone on the aircraft is nothing short of heroic. This crew, from the pilots to the flight attendants, acted under incredible pressure, and the professionalism of quick decisions saved lives. Aloha 243 would become a turning point in aviation safety, sparking sweeping changes in how older aircraft were maintained and inspected. The NTSB's recommendations prompted reevaluation of aircraft life cycles, and stricter guidelines were introduced for pressurization fatigue in older planes, leading to more rigorous inspection routines across the industry. This incident also brought attention to the importance of crew training and passenger communication during emergencies. In the years following this incident, Captain Schorsteimer was lauded for his leadership and calm under fire, and the legacy of Aloha 243 lives on in the safety protocols that we still use today. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the story of Aloha Flight 243. We've explored how a catastrophic incident turned into a pivotal moment in aviation safety. If you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to like the video, leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe to AeroExploration for more in-depth stories and aviation insights. Thanks so much for watching, and we will see you next time.